Hello my dear students of grade 10. Welcome to today's lesson, that is Biosphere. This is the 13th lesson of your grade 10 science textbook, and as you all can see, it's a biology lesson. So you all are familiar with Biosphere. Now if we take the earth, it's made up of non-living components like soil, water, air, so it has the different components. In different parts of the earth, we get living organisms. Parts of the earth where you get the living organisms, we call it the biosphere. So you all know what biosphere is, parts of the world where you have the living organisms. It can be the unicellular organisms or multicellular organisms that are visible to our naked eye or even not visible to our naked eye. So you're familiar with the microorganisms and the macroorganisms. Under that, you're familiar with plants and animals as well. So all these take up the biosphere. So in this lesson, we will be discussing the differences between all these different types of organisms and the easiest and systematic scientific method of grouping them so that we can understand and study about all different types of organisms. So basically, we'll be looking at the classification and nomenclature of organisms, how to group the organisms as well as how to name them in a scientific manner. With that introduction, students, I will move on to the contents. So under Biosphere, we will be discussing classification of organisms. You are familiar with this topic. You all have used dichotomous keys, where you have a group of organisms, maybe animals, plants, or both together, and you classify them based on, let's say, presence of legs, absence of legs. So like that, you group them until you come to a point where you have one organism with one related character. So by looking at all the characters, you are able to identify the organism. Now that's a very simple form of classifying or grouping organisms. Why do you think we need that? We need to learn about organisms, we need to know them, and we need to know their uses, we need to know their characteristics. Now if we try to look at all the organisms together, there are so many different types of organisms. They are very diverse. So it's very, very tedious for a person to remember each and every organism and its characteristics. So to make it easy, we have a method of classification. So this classification helps us to learn about organisms. Thereafter, nomenclature. Again, you all know there are so many different languages. For the same animal, we can give many different names. Same plant can be called by different names depending on the language, depending on the country, depending on the area also. So that can create confusions. To avoid those confusions, again there is a scientific way of naming the organisms. That is what we are going to discuss under nomenclature of organisms. So with that introduction, students, I'll move on to the lesson. Classification of organisms. You're familiar with evolution. Now we have discussed that in grade 9, evolution of the earth and evolution of living organisms. Now the earth evolved around 4.5 billion years ago. So after that, there was no living organisms, only the non-living components. Thereafter, you all can remember the primordial soup. From that, the pre-cell originated. That was like the initial cell that had life. From that, you all can remember the origin of a bacteria, an anaerobic heterotrophic bacteria, a unicellular organism. And from that, the algae developed. And algae were the first organisms that were able to do photosynthesis. They were able to produce their own food. And from there onwards, the organisms became very complex. And if you can think of the animals that were evolved, initially they were the fishes. From fishes, you all can remember they tried to move to the earth and they became amphibians who needed water as well as land. And then from amphibians, the reptiles developed, who shifted to the terrestrial environment. And from reptiles, the mammals as well as birds evolved. So that's how from just one cell, the pre-cell, all the organisms that are there on earth now originated and evolved. So now you all know there's so much of diversity. We have discussed biodiversity also before. So you all know how many different types of organisms are present. So with that, if we look at the introduction, it is believed that life originated on Earth about 3.6 billion years ago. We have learnt in grade 9 that it is 3.5 billion years ago, but 3.5 billion years ago was the time the organisms evolved on Earth. That is, life originated on Earth. It is accepted that the life originated as a unicellular organism. So here you all can remember that. The pre-cell, from that the unicellular bacteria, unicellular organisms, and thereafter the complex multicellular organisms were evolved gradually. So this did not happen very quickly. It took a very long time. So it was a gradual change. So now we have both the unicellular organisms and the multicellular organisms. Today, about 8.7 million species. So you all can imagine the diversity among them. 8.7 million species are living on Earth. So many different types. Can you all imagine understanding and remembering each and every one of these species? It's somewhat impossible, we can say. So easier we classify them into groups and try to identify the relationships, common characteristics, and then you study about the organisms. So there is a great diversity among these organisms. You all know the meaning of diversity. Differences in their character, external features, internal organization of the body, their food habits, that is the nutrition, habitats where they live, all this is different. So you all can remember there are different types of diversity as well. Overall, if we consider, it is known as the biodiversity. Differences among organisms based on all their characteristics. Once these organisms are grouped, it is easy to study them. That's the most important thing. So once they are grouped, it's easy to study them and to use them for different purposes. Why do we use these organisms? One thing, they can become useful to us. We can use, now say from the cow we get milk, then we get egg, we get from plants we get food. So they are useful to us. The same way they can be harmful also. You all know the pathogenic organisms, the microorganisms that cause diseases. So we need to have preventive methods against these organisms. So like that, if we look at the environment, we have to live with these organisms because they are part of our environment. So to know them, identify them, and to get the best out of them, it is easier to classify them and study. I'm sure you all can understand that concept. With that introduction, we will move on to the next slide. So here there is an activity given to you. This is like an activity that you all have done in your smaller grades also. I told you all about dichotomous keys, classifying them based on simple characteristics. So we will look at the activity. Activity, identify the species of organisms in figure given below. So although they say species of organisms, we will try to identify them as a common name as well, because we can't go into exact detail. These are the basic pictures. So we will try to identify these organisms. What is the first one? I'm sure even a small child will know, and I'm sure you all know these very well. So this is an owl. A bird, owl. So you know the organism. Then we have a lion there, a wild animal. Then a zebra. Then we have a fish. Now when we say fish, if you look at the full picture, you can see there are two types of fishes given there. So when you look closely, you can see this is like an ornamental fish, like a goldfish. Not a very large or huge fish. It looks like a small goldfish. So we will consider this as goldfish. That's what I said, students. We are not going to identify the specific species. We will be just identifying the organism. So we'll take this as a goldfish. Then here we have a frog. That you all know. It is an amphibian. You have learned classification to a certain extent. So that's a frog. Then what is this? We can consider this as a common house lizard. A common house lizard. Then here we have a robin bird, and usually this has this crown-like structure, the sharp structure, a robin bird, a red colored robin bird, red robin bird. Then as I told you, this one. This fish, of course, looks very much different from the previous one. You can see, although the picture is small, you can imagine it being a large fish. What is it? We can identify it as the shark. Then here we have the turtle. After that, there is a snake. So we can take it as a rattlesnake, or we'll just stick to the name snake because we don't have any other snakes here. Then look at this plant. Now with these small leaves, and it looks like a shrub-like plant. So we can consider this to be a Cupamania plant. A small one, a plant. Then the next organism, you're familiar with that. A crocodile. Again a type of lizard. Then here you can see this is a cat. Very common, we have in the households also. Then this is something again very common to us, grass. Another type of plant. Again here students, you all can see the difference. Now this plant has branches, the separate leaves, whereas here we have the very thin broad leaves, so you can identify them separately. Then finally another colorful organism, and we have it in our households also. We can see it around us, the butterfly. So we have identified all these organisms. I am sure you all also were able to do it correctly. Then what's the second step? Classify the organisms using appropriate criteria. Now when we say appropriate criteria, say if you look at all the organisms, you all can identify immediately. Now these two, I said Cupamania plant and grass. Those two are plants. All the others come under animals. Do we have a microorganism here? No. So immediately a very simple criteria can be used. We can classify them as plants and animals. A very simple method. That's not the only criteria. There are so many different ones. Now if I ask each and every one of you all to classify, you can come up with different concepts. Now another concept we can see. Now if you look at all these animals, the first row we will take. If we look at these, except the fish, all the other animals have legs. So we can use that as a criteria. Presence of legs, absence of legs, or we can say has legs, does not have legs. So that can be used as another criteria. In addition to that, you can even take wings. Now the robin bird and the butterfly, they have wings. So we can take presence of wings and absence of wings as another criteria. So like that, you all can classify them in different ways. So you all try a type of classification. I will also do a type of classification here. So then we need to compare the classifications. So before I go to the third step, I will classify the organisms using two types of criteria. So one I'll stick to plants and animals, the other one presence and absence of legs. So now that I have the tables drawn there, now it's a matter of classifying the organisms. So in the first table, I will classify them as animals and plants. So I will write the plants here, the first column, and then I'll have the animals there. Then as the second criteria, as I told you, we will take the presence of legs and absence of legs. Or we can say have legs, do not have legs. So I will say presence of legs. So here we will say absence of legs. Then, if we look at the organisms here, you all can look at the organisms. So we have the owl, lion and zebra. Owl, where does this come? It will come under animals here. So, how about presence or absence of legs? It has legs. So that also comes under presence of legs. Then we had the lion. Where does that come? Again, animals. So lion comes under animals. Does it have legs? Yes. So here it comes under presence of legs. Then thereafter third animal we had zebra. So as I told you, it's an animal. So again it has to come here, zebra, and it has legs. So zebra comes under the first two columns. Then if we look at the other two animals or other two organisms given there, you can see goldfish, again an animal, and frog also, it's an animal. How about presence and absence of legs? Goldfish does not have a leg, whereas the frog has legs. But you all know the legs of all these four animals, they are different to each other. But still they have legs. So we will classify them. So here I need to write the goldfish, that is an animal. But goldfish does not have legs. So absence of legs, goldfish. And then we had the frog. So frog, again animal, and it has legs. So frog comes here. Then the other animals. Now here we have the, I said, common house lizard. Common house lizard, again an animal. It does have legs. It has legs. So presence of legs. Then the red robin bird also, it is an animal and it has legs. So common house lizard. That is an animal and it has legs. Common house lizard. Then we had the robin bird. So red robin bird. He also, it has legs. Red robin bird. Then, if we look at the next one, I told you all it's a shark. Now that is also an animal, but that does not have legs. It has fins and it has the fins. So it does not have legs. So here we will have shark as the animal and it goes under absence of leg. Thereafter, we have the turtle. Now you all know turtle is a reptile. It can live on land and inside water and it uses its appendages. We call those flippers for swimming as well as crawling on land. So because it's used for crawling on land, we can call it as legs. So since it's just a classification based on simple criteria, we will take that as presence of legs, although it's given a different name as well. So therefore, I will be including both the turtle under animals and presence of legs. Right. So then, if we look at the next one, snake. So snake, of course, you all know it's an animal and it does not have legs. So absence of legs. So we have snake here under animals, and here we have it under absence of legs. Snake. After that, you can look at these organisms. We have the Coppermania plant and the crocodile. So again, as you know, students, we need to have the plant under plant. We will write the Coppermania plant. Coppermania plant. And where do we put that here? Now it's a plant. Normally when we talk about legs, we discuss the animals, whether they have legs or not. But the plants also don't have legs. They don't locomote. They don't have a locomotive organ. So they also come under absence of legs. So here this has to come under absence of legs. So we need to have the Coppermania plant here. Then after that, we had the crocodile. Now crocodile, does it have legs? Yes. That again is a reptile. So crocodile has legs. Although they are short legs, but they do have legs, crocodile. And they come under animals. Crocodile under animals. And after crocodile, if you can remember the picture, students, we had the cat, grass and the butterfly. So we have cat, grass and butterfly. Where do we put them? So you know cat is an animal. Obviously grass has to become a plant, and we have the butterfly. I'll classify them all together. Butterfly. So we need to write the grass here, plant. And on this side, we have the cat. It has legs. How about the butterflies? Although they are insects, they also have legs. They have tiny legs. So butterfly comes here. But here we need to have the grass. As I told you, although it's a plant, we need to classify it under absence of legs. So I'm sure you all were also able to classify them in a similar manner. If we consider them as plants and animals, only two plants, the Coppermania plant and the grass. All the others came under animals. Owl, lion, zebra, goldfish, frog, common house lizard, red robin bird, shark, turtle, snake, crocodile, cat and butterfly. All of them are animals. So mainly when we say animals, we look at whether they can move around, what their nutrition is, whether they produce their food or they consume food. So from all those, we know these are animals. A very simple classification. Then presence and absence of leg. Now here also we had a problem. Now I told you all turtle, we call it flippers, but still they use it for crawling as well. So anyway, there is reptiles. So reptiles have legs. We put them under presence of legs. And on the other side, although Coppermania plant and grass, they are plants, they are not animals, still they had to be classified under absence of legs. So like this, you all would have come up with so many different criteria. Like I mentioned before, say presence of wings. Presence of wings. and absence of wings. What else did you all use? Maybe presence of a fin or presence of scales. We'll say presence of fins and absence of fins. Then if you take the fishes, you all know they have scales. Even birds, the robin bird on the legs and all, they have scales. So here we can say has scales, does not have scale. Does not have scales. Then we can say has wings, does not have wings. We can even consider their habitat. Lives in water. We can say does not live in water. Like this, you all can classify them in so many different ways. I am sure you would have come up with another criteria. And let's say if there is a class with 30 students in it. If I tell you all to do this activity, obviously each and every one of you all will come up with different types of criteria. So all your classifications will be similar and different from each other. So what is the problem here? Now we wanted to classify the animals and plants. Why? So that it will be easy for us to study. It will be easy to identify the organisms. So what if we have more than one type of classification? Then also it becomes complicated or it's not very useful. So that is the problem here. Here when we classify based on any criteria, then there can be many different types of classifications. That is a drawback. The other thing, now in our classification, plants and animals, it was okay. But when we consider the presence and absence of legs, plants and animals come under presence of absence of legs. That is a drawback. Then if you consider the presence of wings, absence of wings, you all know in the picture we had the robin bird, we had the butterfly. So both of them will come under presence of wings. All the others will go for absence of wings. But you all know the robin bird is a bird, whereas butterfly is an insect. And you know that butterfly is an invertebrate, bird is a vertebrate. So they are different organisms, different animals. But because we use a simple criteria, they come under the same group. Same goes for the others as well. Now again fins. Fishes have fins. All the others, we put them into a different group. That is of course okay. Then if you take scales, again as I told you, the robin bird has scales. The fishes, the shark, goldfish, all of them, both of them have scales. So fishes and birds come under the same group. So that is not a proper classification method. So that is why initially I mentioned a scientific, systematic classification. So we will need to understand and study about that type of classification. So before I go to the next slide, if we go back to the activity, we identify the species of organisms in figure below. So we did identify them, then classify the organisms using appropriate criteria. That also we did. Then compare your classification with other students in the class. So that is what I told you. There can be different criteria. So we have completed that activity. So I am sure you all can understand the drawbacks in classifying organisms using any type of criteria. So with that understanding, students, we will move on to the next slide. So here we try to understand the classification of organisms. When we say classification, grouping of organisms into different levels based on their common characteristic is known as classification. So when we say common characteristics, it's not just one, common characteristics. So many. So then of course we will have to consider all the characteristics that I told you all before. So we need to consider whether it is a plant, animal or microorganism. Then we need to look at the body of that organism, whether it is unicellular. You are familiar with this. Unicellular, just one cell, or multicellular. Then again under unicellular you all can remember. Now amoeba has pseudopodia. Paramecium has cilia. Flagella is present in euglena or chlamydomonas. But then you need to look at whether they have chlorophyll. So all that is considered when classifying unicellular organisms. When you consider multicellular organisms, then you can consider their locomotive, like for unicellular, locomotion or locomotive appendages. Say we can consider legs, we can consider the wings, then fins, flippers, like that. We can keep on considering all their locomotive appendages. Legs also, different types of legs, whether they are short, long, well developed, all that can be considered. Then what else do you need to consider? You need to consider their habitat. When we say habitat, what is that? What are the habitats that you all know? You can say land or terrestrial, then aquatic or in water, or whether it has to be a moist environment. Like that, we can consider environment. So here students, we consider the habitat of organisms. We can consider the land or terrestrial habitat. Under that also you are familiar with different places like the forest, wetlands, grasslands, deserts, all that can be considered. Even the hostile environment. You all know microorganisms can live in hostile environment or extreme environmental conditions. So all those can be considered under habitats. What is the other characteristic you can consider? The mode of nutrition. So here we can also consider the mode of nutrition. Mode of nutrition. So when we say mode of nutrition, what can you all consider? Whether they are autotrophic. Under autotrophic, you can look at the photosynthetic organisms. Organisms that produce their own food in the presence of light energy. And there are chemosynthetic organisms also. You are familiar with both the types. So autotrophic organisms and the other type, heterotrophic organisms. Heterotrophic organisms, the predators. So under that we can consider the herbivores, carnivores, omnivores, all those modes of nutrition can be considered. There is another type of nutrition. What is that? Organisms that live on dead plants and animals. That is known as saprophytic nutrition. So here that also can be considered. Saprophytic nutrition. So all these can be considered for mode of nutrition. If you look at all these criteria, students, there are only a few. Like this, we can look at each and every organism, the structure of the organism, the habitat, mode of nutrition, and all the functions that take place within the body of the organism. So we have discussed some functions before also, like the blood circulation. You're familiar with the different parts of the body like eye, heart, then ear, all these organs present in our body, all those can be considered. Then we have discussed the structure of cells. There are also, some cells have cellulose cell wall, the animal cells don't have a cell wall, all those can be considered. So as a whole, if we look at all the characteristics together and based on those, if we classify the organisms, we will come up with a proper classification method. So like this, scientists have tried to classify organisms in many ways over the years. We are going to discuss a few of those types of classifications, and from there we will be concentrating on the most accepted scientific classification, that is the 3-domain classification. With that introduction, students, I will move on to the next slide. Significance of classification of organisms. So this is something that I told you all before also. Why we need to classify organisms? Significance. So there are various uses of classification of organisms. So when we say various uses, this is why we need to classify them, or the purpose of classification as well as the uses of classification. Both of those are considered here as significance of classification of organisms. So the first one, easy to study about organisms. From the start, I have been telling you all this. Now for any person, however intelligent they are, it's difficult to remember. We said there are about 8.7 million species on Earth. So it's very difficult to remember them individually. When we classify them, it's easy to study. So that is the first significance. Easy to study about organisms. Then the next one, ability to identify specific distinguishable characteristics of a given organism. Now we had that activity where we look at the organism and we say, okay, this is a lion, this is a zebra. How do you all identify that? You know the lion, the color of iron, the mane, how the fur is, and the way, the tail of the lion, the legs, everything from the full structure, the body or the organization of the body of the animal, you know what animal that is. If you look at the zebra, you know the black and white lines. That itself makes it distinct to identify the organism. Then a plant, you look at the leaves, the shape of the leaf, the color of the flower. So if you know, okay, these type of plants need to have a certain type of flower, certain type of a leaf, then you can easily identify the plant. The same way, microorganisms. You all have learnt about bacteria, viruses, then we know about fungus, algae. So we know to differentiate them based on certain characteristics. So that is what we can do here. Ability to identify specific distinguishable characteristics. So that is important. So even though we say specific distinguishable characteristics, when we say protozoans, you all know amoeba is a protozoan, paramecium is a protozoan, even euglena is a protozoan. But you know to differentiate them. How? Amoeba has an irregular shape. You can remember the shape of amoeba, something like this with the pseudopodia. Whereas if you take paramecium, it has something like a slipper shape, something like that. So a shape, and it has like cilia all around it. So from that also you can identify paramecium. Then euglena, again a particular shape with the flagella and green color chlorophyll in it. So based on that, you can identify that it is euglena. So even with single cells, unicellular organisms, you can differentiate them. So obviously, when you know the characteristics of organisms, you can identify the specific distinguishable characteristics. That is the second significance. Then if we look at the third one, ability to get an idea about the whole biosphere by studying about few selected organisms. So we can get an idea about the whole biosphere by studying a few selected organisms without studying each and every organism. So now there are environments where we can access. There are environments which are very hostile or extreme environments. We cannot go to those environments. And even if you take the forest, if you take the Amazon forest, it's a rainforest, a very dense forest. So you can't really go deep into it. Even Sinharaja forest, that is also a rainforest. You all know about the species there, people know about the organisms, the plants, all those living there, but we don't know exactly how many species are there. We don't know all the organisms that live in those forests. So, but to get an idea, if you study a few organisms, you all know how the color of the plants in the rainforest should be, or the color of their leaf, color of their stem. So, and the animals that can live in there. So, those are possible by studying a few selected organisms. You are not considering all the organisms, but based on that, you know about the different ecosystems. So, then you can study about the whole biosphere. All the ecosystems together which have the living organism is considered as the biosphere. So, you can learn about the biosphere. Is that clear to you? Okay. So, then the next one, ability to reveal the relationship between different groups of organisms. Now, ability to reveal the relationship between different groups of organisms. Now, when we take, let's say, arthropods, you are familiar with that. You all know insects are arthropods, spiders are arthropods, crabs, prawns, those are all arthropods. But they are different because they belong to different groups under arthropods. But what is the common characteristic? They all have the jointed appendage, jointed legs. That's what we call as arthropods, jointed legs. So that is a common characteristic. So between the group of insects, between the group to which the crabs belong, and between the group to the group where the spider belongs, you can understand the relationship. So you can reveal the relationship between different groups of organisms. The same goes for mammals. Now, most of the mammals, you all know they are terrestrial and they have legs. You can see the hair on skin, the glands on skin. So, you all know they are mammals. But you all know that bats are mammals. The same way, whales are mammals. Although they are different, they belong to different groups under Mammalia. Still, you can see the relationship because of certain characteristics. Nourishing their young with milk, having mammary glands. So, those are characteristics that help to reveal the relationship between different groups of organisms. So, that is how we can use classification. Then the last one, identification of organisms with economical uses to human. What are economical uses? Now, when we say grass, we might use that for some purpose, maybe to have a grassland in the home garden. But when it comes to the paddy plant, we get rice, we use it for cultivation, for producing food. So, there is an economic use to us. Then if you take the cow, goat, they give milk. Like that, different organisms, even microorganisms. Now you can remember from the fungus penicillium, we get the antibiotic penicillin. So that is useful to us in the field of medicine. There are so many other fields, there are so many other industries where we use microorganisms. So all these are possible because we do the classification and we are able to identify the economic uses to humans. So all this can be achieved by classifying the organisms in a systematic manner. So under that, we need to understand the simple classifications also. What we did before, we have used the dichotomous keys, we have just classified them based on simple characteristics, simple criteria, and we have the proper scientific classification. All those are different methods, all those are useful in different ways, but we need to stick to one particular method. So after this, I will be moving on to the main type of classification. Right. So we will look at the methods of classification. Methods of classification of organisms. So I told you all students, there were different people who tried to classify organisms in different ways and using different criteria. Out of those classifications, we need to consider the classification by Aristotle. Aristotle in 4th BC. That's a very, very long time back. Before Christ, 4th BC, introduced the first scientific classification. So I mentioned this term, scientific classification. So that was a systematic classification. And he did that a very, very long time back. So Aristotle in 4th BC introduced the first scientific classification of organisms. So you have to remember him, that he was the one to introduce the first scientific classification, Aristotle. Then after that, we need to consider Carolus Linnaeus. So Carolus Linnaeus in 18th AD, Anno Domini, after the birth of Christ. So 18th AD introduced a successful classification. So you all have to remember those two people, students. The two scientists, or Aristotle is a philosopher. He introduced the first scientific classification a very long time back. Then Carolus Linnaeus was the scientist who introduced a successful classification. And also we will remember him when we discuss nomenclature, because he is the person who introduced nomenclature as well. So you need to remember these two scientists, Aristotle and Carolus Linnaeus. And according to Carolus Linnaeus classification, all organisms on earth, including human, is classified by two methods. And those two methods are the artificial classification and the natural classification. You all are familiar with the terms artificial and natural. Normally, we refer to natural as the naturally existing things, which were not man-made. And artificial, normally it's man-made. But here, the meanings are slightly different. Why? Because both classifications are made by people. So under that, when we say artificial classification, that is the simple classification based on very few characteristics or just simple criteria like having legs, not having legs, having wings, not having wings, something similar to what we did in the activity. So that is the artificial classification. Artificial classification. Artificial classification. But in the second type, that is the natural classification. Natural classification. In this natural classification, we consider many characteristics. So basically, the scientific classification and the successful classification come under this natural classification. So there we consider more than one characteristics. Like I explained before, many different or basically all the characteristics of organisms in order to classify them. So under natural classification also there are different methods of classification. That is what we are going to discuss next. So Now we will try to understand the two forms of classification. What artificial classification and natural classification are. So artificial classification. In artificial classification, features such as presence or absence. So that's the thing that we consider here. Presence or absence of locomotive appendages of organisms and habitats, etc. are considered. So let's say presence of legs, absence of legs. So then it does not depict the evolutionary relationships among organisms. So here you can say it does not depict the evolutionary relationship among organisms. Now when you consider the presence of wings, I told you all before also, the robin bird and butterfly, they come under the same group. But they are totally different organisms because butterfly is an invertebrate, it's an arthropod, whereas bird is a bird, always, and it is a vertebrate. So there is no evolutionary relationship. So that is the artificial classification. They just consider the presence or absence of a characteristic and also they consider the habitat. So when we say habitat, if you take the aquatic habitat, you have the fishes living there, arthropods like crabs and prawns living there, then there are plants there, algae there, as well as we have mammals like whales, dolphins living in water. So there again, there is no specific relationship. The same way terrestrial. The terrestrial environment has almost all types of organisms. So there also it does not become a very useful classification. So they consider simple criteria. Under that, if we look at examples for artificial classification, examples for artificial classification are as follows. Under that, if we look at an example for plants. Now, there are so many plants you might have learnt in your smaller grades that you can call them shrubs, you can call them herbs, you call them trees. Then there are creepers, there are runners, climbers. Like that, we classify them based on how they grow or how strong their stem is. But that is just a simple classification. The same way, you can classify these plants as ornamental plants, herbal plants. You all know what ornamental plants are. The snake plant or cactus, you keep them in your households for attractive purposes like an ornament. Not for the use as a plant, it's just an ornament for you. So those are ornamental plants. Or plants which are small and have colorful flowers, colorful leaves, mosaic leaves, those come under ornamental plants. Whereas we can look at herbal plants. When we say herbal plants, plants like aloe vera, they come under herbal plants. So that is a different group. Then we can look at poisonous plant. Now poisonous plants, you can consider the tobacco plant. Tobacco plant is a poisonous plant. So there, of course, these plants are different based on their uses or the characteristic that we identify. But there are similarities between these plants. They might come under the same group. So because of that, that is also a simple classification method, but based on just one criteria. So as an example for plant classification, that is the artificial classification, we can classify them. Plants can be classified as ornamental plants, herbal plants, and poisonous plants. The same way, if we consider the animals, like we did before, we can consider the presence and absence of legs. So here we can use can be grouped by the presence and absence of legs. So students, we can classify them based on one criteria, can be grouped by the presence or absence of legs. That is what we did with the activity. Similar to that, we can use the presence or absence of wings. So that is another criteria. Presence and absence of wings. So in both instances, we only consider just one criteria. But what is the problem there? Now when we take presence or absence of legs, you all can remember when we had the plants came to the group where it says absence of legs. But you all know plants and animals are totally different. So that criteria is not very useful. At the same time, if you take presence or absence of wings, then what happens? Under presence of wings, we will be classifying insects as well as birds. But you all know, according to the evolutionary relationship, now insects come under invertebrates. Those are arthropods. And whereas birds are vertebrates. They have a vertebral column and they come under the group aves. So these are totally two different types of organisms. But when we use just one criteria, presence or absence of wings, they both come into the same group. This is a disadvantage of artificial classification, or we can say the drawback of an artificial classification. That is because we only consider just one criteria. The same goes for plants as well. As I told you, ornamental plants, herbal plants and poisonous plants. The same plants can come into 2-3 different groups. Sometimes the plants of the different groups will have very close relationship. So that is why scientists had the need to go for a systematic scientific classification. And that is why we need to understand the natural classification. So if you look at the criteria, under the criteria of presence of wings in the above examples. So I have given that here, birds and insects both are included into a single group. So that is what we discussed. But they belong to two different groups when considering the evolutionary relationship. This is very important. When we say evolutionary relationship, students, we started off by discussing how the organisms evolve. And in that evolution, vertebrates and invertebrates come under evolution of organisms in different periods as well as evolution in different ways. So there is evolutionary relationship between certain groups. So that is not considered in this artificial classification. So according to that relationship, insects and birds cannot come under the same group. They have to be classified as different groups. So that will be considered when we discuss the natural classification. So with these students, I am going to end this chapter. In this chapter, I have introduced you all to classification, why we need to classify organisms, that is the significance of classification, and you all have to remember Aristotle and Carolus Linnaeus for introducing two classification systems. And thereafter I said there are two main types of classification, the artificial classification and the natural classification. So we have tried to understand the artificial classification here. And you all can understand there are a few drawbacks. So because of that, we don't completely discard artificial classification. We use it for simple classification purposes, grouping organisms. But we need to have the systematic scientific classification. That is the natural classification. So I will discuss the natural classification and the type of classification that we will be studying, that is the most accepted classification currently. We will discuss that particular classification. That is going to be the 3-domain classification.